Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Hi, Penny, Colin, Ludmilla. Nice to see you all. If I'm coming through, just say hello in the chat box and let me know if everything is good. Hopefully we won't have the same issue as last week. I made sure my internet was connected to the right version this morning. So this is, oh great, thank you, Penny. Okay, good. So this is technically it's our final critique. Like I mentioned before, we will do a little extra private session next weekend for those who want it. It's completely optional. I know some of you said you didn't quite get around to certain areas of your painting and you're still working on it. So if you would like, just email me back after this session and just let me know if you want to participate in next week's, because I won't send out the link to everyone. I will just send out the link to those attending today. So if you do want to attend next week, just send me an email this afternoon and let me know, and I will send you the link to attend next week. It'll be kind of a last final session for those who are a little behind in their painting. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and open this up. If anyone has any questions, I know some people are still kind of catching up with some of the videos as well. I realize it's a lot to watch, especially those finishing videos. They're very kind of gradual, and I take my time with each section, trying to bring it to a finish. So I know it can take a little while to actually watch the videos as well as work on your painting. So if anyone has any questions about the videos, you can go ahead and type it into the chat box. And if not, we're going to go ahead and start with Penny's critique. Okay, so I don't see any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and just jump in. If you do have a question, you're still typing it out. I will address it at the end of the critiques. So go ahead and continue to submit your question, and I will get to it a little bit later. All right, Penny, are you ready? We're going to go ahead and start with yours. I'm going to pull up your email as well here. So you said that you were able to work on the flowers, the leaves, the oranges, and the bird. So you didn't quite get to the ceramic pot, and there were a couple of areas that you had a challenge with getting the color right, and then other areas where you felt like it went well. Like the bird went well, but you were having trouble getting the intensity in the flower. So let's talk a little bit about things you can do if you want to go back into that flower and brighten it up. So I do see that it's a little higher contrast in your painting, a little bit more dark. And if you want to brighten up those areas, one of the things about flowers is if your shadows get too dark, you lose that feeling of that transparency, of that light filtering through the petals. And remember I mentioned that if you do this grisaille process, your grisaille is a little bit, if it's a little bit on the darker side, and it depends on the types of glazes you're actually going to be putting over. Some glazes are darker, some glazes are a lighter color and they won't darken your painting so much. It depends on what color you end up using and how it comes out of the tube. So like an alizarin crimson is a very dark red out of the tube, and it's going to darken your underpainting quite a bit. So sometimes we have to go back in and scumble, more light in those areas, again, using opaque mixtures. So going into the flower, for example, if we just took some of those shadows, and I could choose the color picker, but I'm going to go ahead and just grab a kind of a deep red, but it's a little bit more of on the pink red spectrum. So for me, I would say if I was choosing the color, I would take a little bit of cadmium red light if you have it, and mix a little bit of whatever alizarin type color that you have into that and make it a little bit more on the cadmium side. So it's a little bit on the lighter side. You might even find that you need to add a tiny bit of white to it if inherently the color is too dark. So you're going to want to go for something probably around this value. Let me grab a paintbrush here. And I'm going to use just this glazing brush because it allows some of that underpainting to show through. But if I do a color sample here, so you're going to want something kind of like that. That's pretty close. Yeah, that's really close to that color. I would say maybe a little more cadmium than what that is. But if you take a little bit of that color and you want to oil out your flower, and I would just hit your core shadows with this scumble. Okay, so the idea is that you're lightening up the color a little bit. You're adding more of that light filtering through. So I'm just going to hit these areas, and I'm using this kind of glaze brush because it mimics a little bit like what a scumble would do. So you can see how that's already adding a little more saturation to that area. And it's lightening up just maybe one value step, and you're just going to hit your darkest darks with this mixture. And I would oil out the flower, and then you don't need to thin out the medium, just put a very small amount of this paint on your brush, and then kind of scumble it over just those dark areas. And you can look for areas like on the left side here, it's going to pick up a little bit more light. On the right side, we have a little less light filtering through, so some of these are going to be a little bit on the darker side, but if you compare that dark red there, let me just do some color swatches here. So that deepest red behind the stems of the center of the flower is pretty much that color there, and then what you have is almost black, and it's kind of dull of a brown. So what we're going to do is mix a color. That would be definitely more, just a little more alizarin into the mix. And maybe if the alizarin is making it too blue, too cool of a red, try throwing in some transparent red oxide because it's also dark, but it will warm up. And so you would have the cadmium red light, alizarin crimson, and a little bit of trans red oxide for this darker area here. Let me grab that glazing brush again. And so you would be going into this area, and it's going to give it a richer chroma, which is what flowers, their richest chroma is often in the shadows because of that light filtering through. When I did the demonstration on painting transparency, you notice that some of the highest chroma areas are in those shadows for when light passes through an object. Think of it like when you're painting something that's somewhat transparent, like flower petals or like a peeled piece of fruit, like an orange. It's almost acting like the way stained glass works. The light is passing through that transparent membrane and the color is filtering in to that. So the more light you have kind of coming through that, the more rich those colors are going to be. So I like to think of it as that, like that film of color. A stained glass window is a great kind of analogy for that effect. And that's why you have those rich chromatic darks. And so the more dull your shadows are, the core shadows are, or less chromatic they are, oftentimes that tells us it's a more opaque object. So there's some subtle difference there, but it's going to help convey those different surfaces in your painting. And they're often subtle, and if you're not aware of them, then we just kind of go into this automatic process of using kind of similar colors everywhere. So just take that into your awareness a little bit, and you can see how just richening up this chroma a little bit here in these darks is making the whole thing feel a little bit more lively. Another area, so what I would do here for this interior and this area here, let's take a sample of that color. So that's what you have as your reflected light, or that's actually not really exactly a reflected light, it's just where the light is passing through even more. But you'll notice that the color is more chromatic than that. So you're really close in value, but your color isn't as chromatic. So we need to pump up that chroma, and that means no white in your mixture if you can get away with it. You would want mostly cadmium red, a tiny bit of your alizarin, and maybe even a touch of your red oxide if it goes too cool. But with all that cad red light, it should stay rich enough. And then if you do the same process, you scumble that into this reflected area, and anywhere where you get that kind of red hot feeling, that glow. There's only a few other areas where I kind of start to see that. That's even down in here, it's a little deeper. So just by playing with the shadows, you can see how that already gives the flower kind of a feeling of being a little bit more rich in color. And you might do a glaze over this pink a little bit more rosy. I'd say it's a little bit more of like a cadmium mix rather than a alizarin mix, and that might mean you're again scumbling, but this one you add a tiny touch of white to it. But I would concentrate on those shadows first, because that's going to make the biggest difference. And you might put in those shadows and be satisfied with the painting, with the richer shadows. So I would start with that and kind of go from there in terms of making your decisions moving forward. Does that make sense? I meant to do that on a new layer, but apparently I painted that right on the painting, so I can't show you before and after, but I'll do everything else on the new layer. But you can already see the difference. I would say the same thing goes for, now the closed flower here is a little bit cooler. It's less, because it's closed up, there isn't as much light coming through. Let me catch up with your questions. The yellow color from the stamens is bouncing back into the petal. That's why I was going for that. Oh, okay. It could be what's happening there. I could see that happening, but I would say it's probably a little bit of both. And sometimes that with transparent objects, they're pretty tricky because you can have those reflected lights happening simultaneously as the light passing through the object. And so, you can kind of think about it in that terms of light logic. Essentially, our cadmium red is a red-orange. And so if that yellow, for example, was bouncing back into that petal, you're going to get, but the flower is actually like more of a pink, you're going to get more of that red-orange reflected light too. So it could be that as well. I could see that happening kind of in this area right here, where it picks up a little bit more orange. And if you go over here, it goes like a little bit more of a cool pink. And you don't quite see that everywhere else. That intensity of this color here. Even down in here, it's darker. So I could see that being part of it as well. One thing that will also help is going a little bit more of a kind of cadmium orange at the center here. So kind of use what you might do when I said cadmium orange, you could use a cadmium orange if you have one, but you could also use your Indian yellow, but just add a very small amount of cad red to it and a tiny bit of white if it feels too transparent, because the idea is that you want to richen up the chroma in that shadow as well. And that's going to make it feel like the light is really bouncing through. It does get into that deeper red-orange, which would be more of like a oxide red as it gets darker. But I would say lighten that up as well. And that's going to reinforce that idea of the light bouncing around. And it's going to make that flower feel more kind of glowing. You will want to adjust your reflection here accordingly. So that is pretty much like this color. You'll want to just intensify it a little bit more in the reflection, but remember to keep it a little darker than the actual flower. Excuse me. The bird looks excellent. I feel like it's pretty much there. There is a slight more like teal type color towards the tail, and I think that's because we're seeing through and there's this kind of yellow influencing that, whereas over here we get more into that ultramarine blue. So over here you could try just in the tail, you have it light enough, do a very, very thin glaze of like a yellow. You don't want it going too green, so you could do, I would say, a tiny bit of yellow mixed with, if you have like a cerulean blue or a blue-green of some kind, a turquoise, excuse me. You could try just in the tail there, indicating a little bit. But that looks great. And I realize you said you didn't quite get to this pot here. Going in to a similar idea is the oranges here. So let's take a couple of samples. So the orange that you have here for that shadow is a little bit more on the dull side, and we want to punch up that chroma a little bit more. So you could easily get a color like that using your Indian yellow with a very small amount of cadmium red in it and a tiny bit of white to get yourself that nice orange. If you have a cadmium orange, you can kind of shortcut and just grab that. You could also get it using a cad yellow and cad red together. You can see it's very close in value. It's a little bit, yours is a little bit darker, so you will want it 1 or 2 steps lighter, but the chroma is more intense. So let's see what happens when we build up a little bit more intensity and lightness in that shadow. Now this one here, let's do a quick comparison, because this isn't quite completely backlit. There is some light bouncing around in there, but you can see it has a little bit more of an opaque quality. So there's the value difference between this part and this part. And you can see yours is a little bit more on the gray side, so you want to beef up the chroma on that one as well. This would be a very similar mixture, it's just going to have a little bit more of the yellow in it. Now what could have happened, sometimes when colors are coming across a little more dull than what we intended, it's because that underpainting was a little bit on the darker side, and if you had gone much lighter than the actual end result that you wanted, and then you glazed that Indian yellow, you probably would have ended up close to where you want the orange. And this is part of the, I would say, the downside of using a grisaille as, you know, the main development for your underpainting is trying to predict how light to make something. And if I had to err on any side, I would say error on the lighter side for the luminous objects because the glazes are going to naturally darken, and if you work with those darker underpaintings, it's going to dull those upper color layers. You want as much light passing through those color layers and hitting the underpainting and bouncing back out to our eyes as possible. So the more white you use, it's going to reflect that back a little more easily. So one way, I'll just do a little illustration here. You probably saw in the book I sent out, I kind of illustrated what was happening. So you have, let's say you have your orange, right? So what we're doing is we have this in grisaille. Let me just do this in grayscale. So you have your orange. Okay. And let's say you have it painted in the value that it is, or you know, 1 or 2 steps lighter. Then you're taking a transparent yellow. Okay, and you're laying that on top. Okay, I'm kind of doing it as if I'm separating these layers. So then you have your light source hitting your painting, and it goes through that layer, it hits that color layer, and passes through and hits that grisaille. And as soon as it hits that opaque layer, it comes back out, and the light filters yellow back to our eyes. So it's that stained glass idea. The light is coming through. So if you have this too dark, less light is going to come back out to our eyes. So that's what's happening in a very literal sense. So one of the reasons why we want our underpainting 1 or 2 steps lighter, it can be from that. Now it doesn't mean if you made your underpainting too dark that it's the end. You can definitely lighten with scumbles, and I find every time I do a grisaille with this technique, I always end up having to lighten. So don't feel discouraged. Everything will kind of have that dull look after the first color layer. One way to kind of experiment with this process is to do a couple of, it's a great exercise, and I was going to have us do it for the class, but I felt like there wasn't enough time. But take one canvas and draw 3 spheres or eggs on there and paint one that's really like a white object. It looks like a white object, is very bright. Paint one that's like a gray, middle gray object, and then paint a black sphere. And if you paint those three different valued spheres, let that dry, and then do a color glaze over it, something like a yellow or anything, and you will see how that underpainting influences the colors. And that will give you a sense of what could be achieved depending on how you address your underpainting. Like I said, I usually end up having to go in and brighten up, so don't worry if that's what's happening. Very rarely are you able to just put on one glaze color layer and then your painting's done, even though we put a lot of work in that underpainting as well. So yeah, it's just part of that process and the learning curve as well. So when you want to go back in and richen up chroma, sometimes you have to do semi-opaque layers, and that's going to give you that richness that you're looking for. So if we went in to, let me get back to my other brush. So if we went back in and scumbled that orange into here, you're going to get that richer color. It's a very similar color here. I would say this one is just maybe a little bit lighter. It's a little more yellow. And then, of course, the white pith is going to be your lightest yellow. And so you'll want to go in and brighten up that as well. And you'll find that there's other areas of your painting where You don't need to lighten it up. So like for example, the pot here, because it's a dark object inherently, you're not going to feel like you need to make it too much lighter. It's just going to be some of these more luminous areas that sometimes it can happen. And this one is a little bit less, it's more yellow, but it's a little less opaque. So just do a couple of color comparisons between the oranges and start to richen up the chroma in those areas. You can see kind of the difference that that's going to create in the whole feeling of the composition. And concentrate on those first, I would say, before you go into the pot here, because the chroma in these is going to kind of help you address the chroma in this color. So if we compared the orange here to the yellow and oranges here, you can see that this one is a little bit more opaque and a little less chromatic than what you're getting in here. These have more of a yellow, this has more of a soft kind of buttery orange. And so you'll definitely want to warm that up a little bit. And that orange, by contrast, is going to influence the purple that you see here as well. So I would address your most chromatic areas first and then go in and work on the pot. Does that make sense? Do you have any other questions? And Penny, if you're working on this and you're, needing a refresher, or if you need any feedback midweek, just send me an email. Like if you're working on the flower and you want me to take a quick look at it, just send me an email and I'll be happy to take a look at that as well. Yeah, I think if you just work on those shadows, you'll probably find that the lights, yeah, they could probably use a little more chroma with a little bit of a glaze, but I feel like those shadows are really going to be what makes a difference. Also, when you go down into the table, you're going to want to go in with a little bit of ochre and red oxide and kind of bring a little more color down into here, especially because your background is kind of a grayish brown. You want to maybe beef up the color and chroma down in here. And that might mean going in with a red oxide glaze and then paint opaquely into that directly with yellow ochre, and you're going to end up with a color very similar to that. Everything else looks really nice. I look forward to seeing the rest kind of painted in. I assume you'll be participating next week because you have a bit of work left that you want to do. Okay, perfect. All right, so this looks great. I think if you just start in those areas and then move on to the pot and the table, then you'll have a pretty much finished painting by next week. I realize it's a lot of work, so just get as much done as possible. And I can always help you through email beyond that critique next week. Thank you so much, and if you have any other questions, just let me know. Nice work. All right, Kathy. Are you in here, Kathy? I'm not sure if I saw you in here. Let's go ahead and I'm going to pull up your email and talk a little bit about some of your questions. Oh, okay. So the only comment you had, oh, there you are. You said that the table's a little sunk in, and I can definitely see that like right in here. But that's pretty much it. It's not oiled out. Okay, so this is looking really good. If you have any specific questions, go ahead and type them in. I think the background, while it is a little more blue than your reference, I actually really like the color. I think it looks really nice, and it adds a little more interest to the overall effect. I would say, and your orange looks really good here. I would say this color is maybe a little bit on the red side. We'll do a quick comparison. And I do feel like we could brighten up a little bit on the top part of the orange just to add a little more volume to it. And these are minor tweaks that are just going to get your painting to pop a little bit more. So let's go ahead and actually just start with the oranges, and we'll kind of move around the painting and talk about different areas. So let's do a couple of color comparisons here. And I really think it's just the top here. So there's the color that you have kind of at that top part of the orange. And you'll see that here we have more of a bright yellow orange. So yours is just a little bit more of a slightly duller red orange, and what we want is a little more yellow. So what I would suggest is if you have a cadmium yellow or even an Indian yellow, but mix a tiny bit of white in there, a little bit of that yellow, and then a touch of maybe a cadmium red to give you more of that cad orange feeling, something a little bit more chromatic and rich. And then you're going to glaze that or scumble that over just this top half. So if you look, it kind of hits right across here and kind of falls down, and it's a little bit on this top part too because that background is reflecting a little bit of light there. Even though your highlight is right here, I would take a little bit of that color. Let me make sure I'm doing this on a new layer. And just look at where you could kind of brighten up the top of the orange. I would maybe do a little bit around the highlight just to help the light logic a little bit. Maybe a little bit back in here on the other side. And then your highlight could probably use a little more intensity. Just to bring that up a little bit. Yeah, I would say even over here, maybe a little more cad yellow. So you're just doing scumbles. It's plenty dark enough, so I would just look at where you can build up some of that yellowish light in the orange. And even this color maybe a little bit more chromatic just as a transition out of that yellow, but leave your shadows what they are. So this would just be a little more cad red in that mixture. And that's going to help get that glow. You could probably even take an opaque rich green and just hit that little spot there, just to give some contrast to that area. And then let's take a look at this orange here. It's very similar. I would say again, it has just a little more yellow. I'm just going to make a quick comparison. So it's slightly more opaque on that side. Yeah, so what I would do is take maybe something similar to this, but dull it down just a little bit. Or you would just scumble it on a little bit thinner so that some of this under orange can show through, and just intensify some of this a little bit. Now, one thing I noticed, look at how rich that cad orange kind of shadow feels. It's very deep, in value, but it's also very, very chromatic. And right here, this is feeling a little bit more on the gray side. So if we compare that shadow, now there is some of that pith taking on the grayish color, but if we look in between at the membrane of the orange, it's a very, very rich red orange that's a little bit deeper. So if we went in and just hit some of those areas, and maybe even taking a deeper red, like if you used a little bit of a alizarin crimson with transparent red oxide and just glazed the bottom edge of your orange where it meets the table, it's going to help it turn under but give it a little more of that chroma. I can see you increase the chroma in this little spot here, but it still might need a little bit. That almost looks like cad red with a red oxide right in here. So just look at, again, it's kind of similar to Penny's flower, where those shadows, if you beef up the chroma in the shadowy parts, it's going to help the orange feel like it's glowing a little bit more. And maybe in like this area, more of a yellow, like an opaque yellow. There's quite a bit of yellow in the pith here. You use a little Indian yellow just to add a little bit of area where it's a little on the warmer side. It's kind of a dull yellow, but you might even be able to use a little ochre in that section. So let's take a look at that. So yeah, just rich up that shadow on that peeled part of the orange. And that's going to make a big difference. You actually captured it here, but I do feel like this one is a little bit dark. But I feel like that color is very close to maybe what you needed over here. But if you take a little cad yellow with cad red and just do a very thin scumble, oops, I did not select the color. Yeah, that's like a cad yellow. You can leave some of the darker areas, but I would almost go through and highlight some parts of the membrane with a little bit more of a yellow-red, sorry, a yellow-orange. And where it gets thinner, I think it gets a little bit brighter. Like it gets deeper down in here and it gets a little lighter and more opaque as it gets closer to the pith. And that's partly because this membrane thins out a little bit. You can leave some of those deeper reds. It's going to add a nice texture. I would just add a little bit light there. Okay, so let's see. This looks nice. If you wanted to, you could take a little bit of this orange that you used there and just highlight like the rim before it gets into shadow. Right in here, just a little touch, or any area, real thin area, just to brighten up some of that contrast. I would use that same glaze color, that red oxide alizarin glaze, again down towards the bottom to just liven up that color. Okay, so those are my suggestions for the oranges. Do you have any questions about those? One thing I think that would help, we have a lot of blue that's very similar in this background area and the cup, And so, and then same thing for these leaves. So you can see how those are very, very gray. I think you should glaze over them with a yellow, and that should give you a little bit more of a yellow green. I would use a transparent yellow like Indian yellow, and then you can always go back in with a mixture of this kind of green. I would say a little ultramarine blue, yellow ochre perhaps, and a white would give you a kind of a minty green like this. There's a couple of other greens that might work. Viridian is going to be too cool. If you have a chromium oxide green, that might work, but again, it might still be too cool. I feel like you're going to still need to add some yellow into it. But if we kind of added a glaze of a yellow green, let me just pick a yellow that is a little bit more like Indian yellow. So if we just added a transparent glaze, let me grab the glaze brush, of a yellow over that, it's going to pick up a little bit more of that green. It's a subtle difference. It won't look exactly like that just because this is digital, but it's going to give you a little more of that differentiation between the cooler colors in the background and that nice rich yellow-green that you have here. And like I said, you can even go back in with a semi-opaque and add those highlights again. Okay, so I like the glazes that you've added, the little motifs. They look great. Are you going to put in the little pink flowers here? Or this line here along the stem? I actually think it would help to balance out how white this is. It feels almost, I realize it's really, really white, but this almost comes across as too white in a strange way. I feel like it should be a little closer to maybe what the flower is here. So maybe whatever color you used as a glaze over the cup, maybe just very faintly glaze the handle. That way it feels a little bit more similar to the cup and the saucer. There's a little bit of a gold rim here, and what's going to make that feel gold is to make sure that you have a very rich brown where it's dark. It looks like you do. And then that highlight, go with a little ochre and white, and then just hit that highlight there on that rim. I don't know if I can select it. Yeah, just a little bit of a... Grab a different brush here. Not the right size brush. It should feel like a little brighter. And then maybe a slightly, usually when I'm painting gold, I'll have the brown and then I'll do a little bit of ochre and then I'll do a yellowish highlight in the middle, and that's going to give you that shimmer of gold. And you can do that along this here as well. If you look at this, almost looks like that gold, similar gold color. So just make sure you're using a really rich red brown, and then as it gets closer to that highlight, switch to maybe an ochre and then have that yellowish white highlight there as well. I think the cup and the flower looks really nice. Have you decided if you're going to add this little shadow? I don't know if the composition necessarily needs it. I'll leave that entirely up to you. I would say the only part that's a little confusing maybe is where this rim is here. If is it out here or is it in here? So you might, maybe when you're going around with that gold rim color, add some back in here, and just allow it to be a little bit more of a strong silhouette with that background. Yeah, okay, okay. So when it comes to the background, whenever I have a very dark value meeting a very light value, it's always tricky to handle those edges. I would say softer is better, because we want that focal point to be, and those harder edges to be in our objects that are the primary focal point. So even this edge here, by it being such high contrast, it tends to pull the eye a little bit. That's where this shadow can help, because it helps these two kind of merge. But there's another way around that, and that would be to take some of this color here, which you notice is not pulling the eye nearly as much, and going in and just scumbling a little bit right along that edge. Almost imagine like the light is passing behind just a little bit, or the wall is reflecting into that wood just a little bit. So you can see the difference that makes. It hits that edge a little less harsh. And I would even just soften that edge a little bit more as well. And how I do that is I would take whatever color you have here, make it a step lighter, and then take this background color, and you just re-wet a line there, and then paint that middle transition color and blend them a little bit. Same thing over here. Now this is a much bigger jump, so I would take this color and just go 1 or 2 steps lighter and just hit the edge. And then take that background color and just blend it in to that edge as well. Because by contrast, that edge is going to be very obvious to the viewer, so we don't need to really describe it with a really hard line. Yeah, it's kind of tricky to do straight lines, but you will find that the softer you make it, the more ambiguous you make it, it's not going to be as tricky. So it could be that you're having, so if you lay it in, for example, and then you just take your brush and kind of stipple across the surface like you saw me do to blend out like a glaze, and you just kind of go along this edge kind of and stipple in this direction, bringing these two colors together. The softer you make it, the more it's going to look like a straight edge, and it won't be pulling the eye so much. Just keep going over that area and trying to lighten it. Another thing that would help is to take kind of the lighter brown that you plan on using. I would say something that has a little bit of an ochre tint to it, and just go a little bit lighter where it goes back. So you could just lighten up the table in general towards that back edge just a little bit. And even taking some of that same color, and I can tell you started to add some in here, and this is kind of sunk in, so it's a little hard to read. But if you use that lighter color towards the back there, that's going to also help to balance and help keep it from feeling like it's going down too heavy, if that makes sense. This is kind of an odd tangent where this dark of the wood grain hits the edge of that orange. So I would just kind of simplify that maybe a little bit. I would go on the lighter side. Sometimes things just happen that way in our paintings and or in our reference, and we're not quite sure how to handle it in the painting, and sometimes it's just best to cut it out completely. Let's see. Can I help you with the reflections of the oranges in the table? Yes, absolutely. I was actually going to talk about that just now. Okay, so let's take a quick comparison of the color that you have there, which looks like something like that, and that. And let's take a quick look here. So I would say more chromatic. So what's happening is you have a red-orange reflecting into that table on a table that has a red tone as well, like a red-brownish tone. So there's a couple of things happening here. So let's first talk about the chroma. So if you intensify the chroma of this reflection, and remember that it is a direct reflection of that orange, so the light mass of the orange is reflecting here, it's just reflecting darker. So this shadow is going to be more like right here. I think what's confusing it is that there's a cast shadow also from this orange happening here. So that I could see how that's throwing you. So let's see how we can simplify that a little bit. So I'm going to just try and find an abstract kind of pattern. And I would maybe even just enhance the intensity of that reflection. Personally, that's something I would probably end up doing. And then let's do the same thing here, especially for this transparent one. Just enhance the reflection a little bit, and then where it's a shadow, it's a little bit more of a kind of a rich red. And then what's helping it jump as separate from the table a little bit more is how this is kind of a cooler brown and it's somewhat opaque, and that's because it's reflecting. So when you're talking about a reflective surface, you have, with like wood, for example, polished wood, we see through the grain. It's kind of like water. Sometimes looking through water, you see through the water, and you can see like the rocks underneath. So in this case, we can see the richness of that wood grain. And then in other areas, we see a reflection of the environment. So in this case, it's a reflection of that bluish wall, and that's kind of informing what we're seeing. So as it moves closer to us, like here we're seeing a reflection of that wall, whereas down here and in here and out here we're seeing a little bit more of through that wood grain. So down here we have a cooler, more opaque brown. I have a purplish brown, and I can't tell if that's just because it's sunk in. But if you go in and make a more opaque brown, so for that color I would maybe take ochre, the red oxide, and a little bit of blue, and maybe the ochre would be enough, but if it's not, add a tiny bit of white, and that's going to cool it off just a touch. And you're going to use that in this foreground, and it's lighter than the cast shadow or the reflections of the orange. It's lighter than the value of those reflections. So that is part of what's happening there. So maybe your table just got a little bit on the dark side. This one's even lighter brown. So over here, and we kind of lose a little bit of the edge. I'm just comparing some of these colors here. So it's a little more dull. So you can see how this color differs from what's happening like back in here. So it goes from being this kind of more grayish, light, opaque brown to here where we're seeing a little bit more through it. Of course, this is ignoring the darker wood grain, and then it goes into that color again. So there's a little bit of that pattern happening there. So maybe going just a little bit lighter in that foreground will make the difference for the most part. Does that make sense? How to handle those? And the same goes for the other orange peel as well. So it has very similar colors happening in its reflection, and then more of this kind of opaque, cooler brown around here. Maybe your brown is too red here, and that's going to, if you kind of tone that into more of a neutral brown, that might help to get your oranges to pop a little bit more as well. Let me bring this up here. So, oh, and you can see that this corner definitely gets lighter because that's where the light source is kind of coming from. So maybe work on shifting that hue just a little bit. So one thing that will help also, so it's kind of interesting whenever you're working on a reflective surface because, like I said, it's like water where, you know, the ripple faces the sky, we get the blue sky reflecting. The same thing's happening here. And then where it's turning away or the light is being blocked, you usually see through the water. So like if you're looking at water and you're, a tree is kind of shading the water, that's usually where you can see through it because it's not reflecting the sky. The same thing's happening here where the saucer is. So we can actually see through the varnish on the wood and the richness of that wood here because it's not being reflected. So right in here where below the saucer is where you're going to end up with your more rich kind of red browns. And then you go in more with your dull browns around that, and that's going to help it feel more reflective and separate from those reflected areas. Of course, it goes darker as well. I'm kind of oversimplifying a little bit of that reflection. And you have, of course, your cast shadow. And this is where that cast shadow gets a little bit complicated because it starts to reflect. So it just takes on, it is still darker, but it just takes on a cooler feeling. Does that make sense? Well, okay, so you're darker, if it needs to go darker here, yes, you would do that with a glaze. This is probably going to be somewhat opaque because if you look at it, it is kind of a gray color. So I'll just point out that that is that color there. And then this color is that color there. And these are the table colors, kind of moving foreground to background. And then on the right side, it's a little bit lighter. So let's just take a quick look there and just see. So that's how you're going to define those reflections. And you can see actually lightening up that table and making it a little bit richer color is going to help balance the whole still life. I think it just felt too dark and heavy on the bottom. So I would work on those areas, and everything else will kind of tie together. Really nice work. I love this composition. I like how you brought this in. The pith and stuff, that looks great. I think especially once you brighten up those oranges on the left side. And if you have any questions midweek, just let me know. And I assume you want to participate next week? And I will send everyone their paint overs at the end of class, like I do every week, just so you have the before and after kind of comparison. You're very welcome, Kathy. Really nice work. If you have any questions, just let me know. Oh, great. I'll see you next week then. All right, Colin. Let me pull up your email here real quick. So you mentioned that you softened a couple of edges and now you feel like you're kind of fiddling in your painting. And that's always a trick. And to determine when you're finished is always probably the hardest part of painting, because I feel like we are our own, harshest critic for one, but we tend to, we're too close to the painting at this point in time. When you're getting close to the finish, you've been staring at the painting for several weeks, especially with this type of method. And sometimes you can't tell what works and what doesn't. Sometimes you feel like, oh, I just did something, I made it worse, or, I can't tell if I'm improving it at this point. And you said you've been fighting the red background a little bit. Yeah. Here would be my suggestion. When you're feeling like fiddling and you're not going anywhere, you're not improving, put the painting away. Don't varnish it. Just kind of set it aside, put it away. And I usually I have a storage cabinet in my studio that I put all drying paintings in and ones that are finished. And I just put my paintings away and I don't look at them for like a month almost. I will start new projects and work on those, and then bring the painting out when you feel ready to look at it again. And I would oil out the whole thing and take one final look at it. And you will see it with clearer eyes because you kind of removed yourself from the painting a little bit. You're not as invested in it. And your eyes haven't kind of become too accustomed to looking at it. And that can help you see more clearly, more objectively, what needs correcting. Or maybe you were obsessing over an area that was bothering you while you were working on it, and then you'll pull it out later and you'll say, wait, why was that bothering me? I don't even notice it anymore. So I've done that with work. I typically do that with my work anyway. I will put it away and then I'll bring it out later and take one last final look at it, kind of all oiled out, and just kind of let it be, or I'll work on it one more time. So I would suggest that if you're feeling like I'm just kind of noodling and I'm not really sure what the painting needs. And I'll give you a couple of suggestions here, but I would still, even after my suggestions, I would still encourage you to just kind of put it away for a while and bring it back out when you've kind of moved on to other projects, and take one more objective look at it. Just to give an example, I remember working on this one drawing for a very long time, and I absolutely hated the drawing. I felt like it was the worst drawing I had ever made, even though it wasn't really. I was just in that mental state, and then I put it away, and then a couple of years later, I actually found the drawing and pulled it out, and I was really surprised at how different I looked at it. It wasn't nearly as awful as I remember thinking it was. I mean, it had some errors, but I just remember thinking I was ready to tear it up and toss it. So it really shows you how like your mental kind of attachment to the painting or whatever project you're working on can kind of cloud your judgment of it a little bit. Or sometimes you won't see what's wrong with it until you bring it out later, and then suddenly whatever you were having a hard time pinpointing will jump out at you and you'll say, oh, I know exactly what I need to do to fix it. So that's a suggestion I have. Let me catch up with what you've said. You've made the edges darker. You left it for a few days. You were concerned with loading more paint into the background. Oh, I see. Yeah. Thickness of the paint. Okay. Yeah. So one issue that can happen if you repaint and repaint and repaint one area, it can get that, artificial texture effect. Here's something that you might consider doing, but I would wait until the painting has dried for a while and you've put it away and you can come back at it with fresh eyes. I would take a very small amount of linseed oil and some wet dry sandpaper and sand down the background a tiny, tiny bit if you're going to repaint back into it. I've done this with work that I'm wanting to completely revamp, but let's say I needed to move something and then the texture of previous paint layers, you could see where I had my shadow edge, or you could see where I had, built up thicker paint and I want to adjust it and not have that really heavy buildup. I take a little bit of wet dry sandpaper, a little linseed oil, and I just lightly sand carefully the areas I want to retouch, and then I wipe off with a little bit of linseed oil and Gamsol. Clean it off with like a dust-free kind of rag. You can use just like a microfiber. Make sure it's really well cleaned, and then you can go back in and paint, and it will help with that issue. And that buildup tends to show up more on panel than it does on like canvas. So I could see what you mean. It was maybe a little frustrating to go over those areas so many times. Yeah, so, I really think it looks like this area is kind of sunk in, but I like that you darkened this. I think the whole painting actually reads better with a darker red background. That's just my personal opinion, because it helps the scales, which I feel are the primary focal point or one of them. It helps them pop forward, whereas here they get a little bit lost with that fabric. So it's not always, you have to remember, it's not always about copying the photo or even copying your reference if you're working from life. It's about making the best painting that you can. And sometimes that means tweaking what's there and changing it for the better. So let me read what you've been writing here. Yeah, you don't want that palette knife texture thing happening. Yeah, because it can feel superficial. It almost, especially with a lot of the prints that come out of like the big print manufacturing things, what they'll do is they'll take like you have, I don't know, Hobby Lobby and those kind of prints. They usually take like a gel medium and create this faux texture all over the canvas, making it look like brushwork, and then they print on top of it. And that's what your painting can start to feel like if you've done the same thing. Essentially, you painted over the area too many times. And if it's too different than other areas of your painting, especially in the darks, if you have texture in the darks, it really doesn't look good. You want your darks to kind of feel flat and simple, because they tend to reflect the light of the room a little bit more. So you've been trying hard to make the cloth look like cloth. Yeah. It depends on if you're trying to get that true crushed velvet feeling. One thing I would just say is look for as much structure in the cloth as you can. And softer edges in most areas, with the exception of a few areas, will give you a feeling of a more natural cloth. But looking for the structure of the folds. So I'll do a little illustration here. I'm going to kind of exaggerate it. But when you're painting Let me just do a little bit of sketching here. So when you're painting fabric, one of the things that is tricky is defining where the folds are, because everything's kind of a cylindrical form oftentimes. So you have like, I'm just going to kind of take this section here, for example. So you have the edge of the fabric, and then you have all of these other folds that are happening, and the point of tension is up here, and everything's draping from that point. So you're going to have some where there's little tight areas, and then where it kind of loosens up and the plane changes. So for example, if we zoom in and kind of concentrate on this area right there, what we have is a very defined contour. Let me take that deeper red here. And then it kind of flattens out into another plane. So we have this very tight cylinder, and then it kind of flattens out. And so part of that, trying to analyze what's happening in the fabric, always start with your shadow. And depending on the fabric, it's going to kind of change how quickly it rolls from shadow to light. Then you have kind of that central light, and then it softens out. And then we have kind of an average mid-tone, which is a little bit darker. Let me go a little darker than that. But it's somewhere between that shadow. So with the velvet, you have this really sharp kind of transition, and then down here it loses that hard edge and starts to break up into kind of a flatter plane, and the edges start to kind of melt away, if that makes sense. And then you'll sometimes get a larger kind of shadowy form, but it's not as like cylindrically defined. It's not as much of a defined cone shape, for example. And because it's velvet, it tends to break up just a little bit like that. So the trick with fabric is trying to find the structure. So if you can define it as a cylinder or a cone, try to look for that structure built in, and then look for the areas where it falls flat. I hope that makes sense. Oh, well, thank you, Colin. I'm really happy. So you said you just want to share how much you've enjoyed the training and you're starting to follow the same structure in your other work. Yeah, and I tried when I designed the classes. Thank you. Thank you for that comment. When I try to design the classes, it's not always, I am addressing specific topics like portraiture or, still life in this case. But the techniques are kind of universal, and I try to focus on the foundations that really set you up for success no matter what you're painting. If you're painting trees, or if you're painting, water, or, anything. It's that foundation and having a very clear process that you can follow that makes a huge difference when especially if you're just working on your own and you're self-taught. You don't have that structure of like an atelier environment. Having a process that you can say, okay, I know the first step is this, and the second step is this, and it can feel very rigid in the beginning, but over time you will start to loosen up and find what works best for you. But having that kind of set process in the beginning really, really helps, especially when you're trying to fast track your learning and improve your skills in as short a time as possible. Because we all want to get to that point where we can actually express what we're trying to express and not struggle so much with the technical aspects of painting. So to answer your question, yes, always work from the shadows. Now with watercolor and other media, sometimes you work light to dark. With watercolor, you start with your lights and you put down your lightest colors, and then you slowly build your shadows. But with oil painting, it's easier if you start by establishing those rich shadows, because we always compare those lights to those shadows. So I always start with my shadows and move towards my lights. And part of that is because value control in the lights is really tricky. And if your painting, as you can tell, ends up too light, then you lose, you know, any kind of sense of value structure and that three-dimensional, especially in like a more classical technique, or if you're using a more, you know, chiaroscuro or dramatic lighting, you really need those shadows to be rich. And, you know, they are kind of the stronghold of the painting, the structural, you know, foundation of the painting, where the details kind of lay on top, and those are the fun, you know, juicy parts that we really enjoy. But I always think of that first initial value or color pass where we're getting the darks and the lights in relationship to each other. That's really what holds the painting together as a whole. And sometimes when you go in and you start detailing, as you probably found maybe with the fabric, you start to lose some of that structure. You start to lose some sense of that clarity or that unity for the whole piece, because sometimes the more details you add, it starts to break up some of that. And so I always say go back a step mentally, go back one step, and even physically in your painting, take it back one stage and go back to that simple statement if you have to. And that's where I would say, like, sand down the area and then go back to the block in stage. You know, start by establishing the structure of the fabric again, and then move forward again from that by adding more details. So it just helps to remember that you can always go back a step and then move forward from there. And it does help. Especially in those beginning stages, yeah, you always want to start by addressing your shadows. And I like to, and it depends on the lighting. So let's take an example of a backlit portrait or a backlit subject matter. Sometimes if you're just having a, I'm just going to take this away here and do a real quick example. Let's say you're painting something where the rim light, the main light source, is just a rim light on the object, and most of the form that you see is in the shadows. So if we just took a simple, let's just say, we're going to keep it simple since it's still life, we're going to do an egg. If you have really strong sunlight kind of as a backlight, rim light, that's going to fall into this really intense kind of bright yellow, let's say. And then you're going to have your core shadow, which is going to be quite dark. But because we see so little of the form in the lights, most of our value variation is going to be within the shadow. So this is, you know, kind of a different way of thinking about, you know, your lighting. So let's say you're still going to have some volume in that shadow. So you're still going to have areas of darker and lighter, but most of your form is going to be described by the secondary light source or a reflected light. So let's take a sunlit kind of, or a sunset scenario where the sky light, the ambient light in the sky, is what's showing off the form in these areas. So in the shadows. And we, as the viewer, on the shadow side of the form. That rim light still needs to be considerably brighter than any highlights that happen in that shadow, but most of the detailing occurs in the shadow, and the simplicity happens in the light. In our situation here, where we have a more traditional light source, we want most of our detail in the light and simplicity in the shadow. So you kind of want to pick one to keep more simple and one that's more complex. Whatever shows the form, that's the one that you're going to have more detailed. And then whatever is in shadow or whatever is not showing the form as much is going to be simplified in your painting. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, so a lot of things you'll see if you've taken multiples of my courses, the foundations are similar, but there are a lot of things that, you know, vary between skin tone and painting an orange, for example. But there is that foundational process and element that kind of crosses over all subjects. Okay. All right, guys, thank you so much. Does anyone have any last minute questions before we wrap up our critique for today? All right, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you guys for tuning in, and I will send out your critique paint overs. Let me just take this down. So, Colin, just to reiterate, just really briefly, I would just set aside the painting. Maybe look at simplifying this shadow side here. That's one of the reasons I did this demo here. But think about maybe simplifying some of the shadows. If you want to readdress the red fabric, I would wait. There aren't really too many edges that are pulling my eye at this point. But I would, yeah, just give it a little bit of time. And if you do decide to go back in and paint into the painting, Colin, feel free to reach out to me at any point. And just, you know, if you have specific questions or want any feedback, I can do that through email or through our forum. And thanks for tuning in, Ludmilla. Thank you. All right, guys. Have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you next week. And Colin, you're welcome to join in next week if you want. If you do decide to work on the painting, then feel free to send it in again for one more final critique. All right, guys, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your weekend and stay healthy and safe. Bye, guys.